All right. Hey, everybody. Today is our topic 8 study group. The topic is called Other Database Structures, but really it is about how to use this one kind of database called MongoDB. So MongoDB is basically, it's a company that created this kind of way to store your data. And to contrast what we've talked about so far, it's kind of like a different kind of SQL. It's non-SQL. So whereas SQL is more in table formats, we'll see in a little bit that MongoDB is like a database type to store dictionary style data. So when you don't have like a same number of keys for every object or every observation, MongoDB might be something that you consider. I would say at this point, I wouldn't I wouldn't think to implement MongoDB at our stage where we are right now. Again, it sort of like ties together with like, since we're learning SQL, might as well learn this. But this is more useful for later when we get into bigger scale projects. If you're working with very, very large, like millions and millions of like dictionaries, then we'll talk about implementing MongoDB. But just for context, so that you all are aware of how important this is for now, it's really not the most important thing to get familiar with at this point. And yeah, why I'm sharing my entire desktop because MongoDB is a little bit difficult to set up. And there are a couple of things I want to point you all to. I'm going to go over this in a little bit, but basically on your lessons, you have instructions on how to install and properly run MongoDB. One part that's not super clear is that I want to show you on my terminal window here. So this is the window that is running my Jupyter notebook. But in a separate terminal window, I have to launch my Mongo shell. So here, let me move my Zoom things away for a second. So over here, the last thing that I typed in my terminal is Mongo, just the word Mongo. And then all of this came up to show that my Mongo shell is running. So you have to have a Mongo shell running in the background concurrently with your Jupyter notebook in order to have them interact with each other. Sometimes students have this running and then they stop this from running, and then nothing is able to execute in your Jupyter notebook. And this is why you just have to have this window, a terminal window running your Mongo. All right, so that's for later when we get to working with MongoDB. Basically today we're going to talk about what Mongo is, some of the terminology used, followed by some of the basic actions within Mongo. And we'll go through like a CRUD process, which I'll talk about what that is in a little bit. Okay, a lot of text here. A lot of this does come from the reading, so I'm going to do a really quick paraphrase summarize. This is to basically contrast table form data. So a document store is a database that stores records as unique documents in the database. So rather than a database with multiple tables and tables with multiple rows, a document store is kind of like the parallel, whereas instead of tables, you have a bunch of dictionaries. So what's unique about this is that documents can be arbitrarily long and even contain other documents inside of them. So if we remember, our dictionaries can be very nested as we work with like APIs, and we've worked with, just nested dictionary structures. They can contain like documents within documents, and document stores, of which MongoDB is an example, allows us to store this kind of nested structured data different from tables, because tables don't really interact well when you have that kind of very, nested data. So within each document store, every document has key value pairs. So again, terminology that's very similar to what we learned with dictionaries. Dictionaries are made out of key value pairs, with actual data being stored in as the value. So therefore, they're very, very flexible because each document can be unique. Again, there's no constraint saying that each document must have the same keys. Again, I want to draw the contrast between this and tables. If you have, let's say you're a table of, movie information, and maybe for some movies, you don't have genre data. If you don't have genre data, then, you end up with having a bunch of null values, which may lead to problems, as I think some of you have been facing. If you have null values, it leads to problems when you're trying to do your analysis or trying to do your cleaning. In a document store, if you don't have the genre data, just don't have that key for genre. So yeah. So since, okay, I'm not going to talk about this specifically. So there are a bunch of instructions on how to install MongoDB on your computer. It's going to be slightly different for Windows versus Mac. Again, this is not a priority for right now, but whenever you do decide to get to MongoDB, that is something that is actually one of the most common things that I have to help students set up. So if you run into anything, whenever you decide to do this, just let me know. But today we're going to talk mostly about CRUD, and I'm just going to demonstrate what these processes look like, just in case you one day decide to use a MongoDB database for your project or anything like that. You've at least seen it before. So CRUD processes. If in the future you see any sort of data engineering kind of job title, CRUD will be part of the job description for sure. And so CRUD is just short for create, read, update, and delete. These are the 4 processes that we're going to walk through. And it's basically when you have to interact with the database, these are the 4 kinds of interactions that you can do with any kind of database. You know, with SQL, I know with SQL, we mainly just did like the reading of databases, but later on, we'll talk about with SQL, how you can create, update, and delete data in your SQL database. That's a topic for later on. So working with MongoDB through Python. So there's a couple other libraries that you do have to install for working with Mongo with your MongoDB. Very similar to how with SQL we had that cursor. We kind of need something similar for Mongo. And so Mongo has a library called PyMongo, so Python Mongo, that allows us to connect to a client. So this is exactly the same thing as, well, not exactly the same thing, but very similar to the process when we had that cursor that was able to connect to our SQL database. So this address here should be the same for most computers. I believe it is also here. So if you don't know what that, if you don't know what that number is, if you run into issues with running that cell, like connecting to the Mongo client, if you run into issues there, this is where you can get that address. So I think that's the last thing I wanted to show you all on the terminal. So let me just reshare the screen here. All right. So what we're going to do, we're pretty much just going to use PyMongo, but I'm going to demonstrate the CRUD processes with some scraped data. So just an example of I'm scraping data, I want to throw it into a MongoDB database. This is just a very, very easy, quick example that we're going to use. So therefore, we're going to use requests in Beautiful Soup. So first off, we're importing these libraries. We connect to Mongo. As long as no error message pops up, you should be okay. But another thing that you can do is you can print whatever databases exist. So here you can see that I have these 3, admin, config, and local. These are just databases that exist in your local Mongo by default. And this is one that we're actually going to create together called the quote database. So I have very, very quick web scraping code, and this is not a lot of data to play around with, but good for demonstration. This is the same thing that we went through with the scraping of the books. Is very, very similar. But basically, this is the data that I have. As you can see, it's a list of dictionaries, and it's a database of quotes. So here we have like a quote by Albert Einstein. We just have quote and author for each observation. That's what we're going to store in our MongoDB database, and hopefully we can keep this key value structure rather than have, you know, a table with a column of quotes, column of authors. Again, you could argue that maybe in this example, maybe table is better, but, you know, for the purpose of demonstration. Okay. So to create a database, it's actually this first line over here. So the hierarchy of information goes from database to collection, and within your collection is where all your dictionaries go. So that's why here we're creating a quote database and we are creating a quote collection. So when I run this, I mean, if you didn't have this before, after running this this cell, you will have the quote database. And basically on your computer, you can have as many databases as memory allows. I'm going to run this cell because this just clears the collection within the database to reset the database. I'm just going to do that to start off. And then we're going to just talk about our CRUD processes. So a little bit more explanation here. This is pretty much what I've already said. Just like a SQL database has tables, a Mongo database has collections for documents. So therefore, when I'm running my methods and running my functions, I'm actually going to be running it on the collection. So therefore, you can see here when I'm inserting my data. And so actually, let me quickly talk about my collection is the collection. And then quotes for Mongo is this list of quotes over here. And actually, let's see how many we have here. Len of quotes for Mongo. Oops. Quotes for Mongo is 10. So how this works is you call on the collection dot insert many and then quotes for Mongo. So just like that, you can see that it has inserted 10 objects. They each have this like random ID that's assigned to it. Not super important to know what these are. This is basically where it is stored. Or sorry, it's not where it's stored. It's automatically generated ID. But yeah, you can see that these IDs have already been inserted. The reason why I can pull these inserted IDs is this action of inserting many, I just happen to save it to a variable results, which is why this results, I can actually get the attribute of inserted IDs. It's just one of the ways that Mongo works. You can actually store an action into a variable. So if the action has, characteristics or attributes, I can pull them out. So therefore, I'm able to see inserted IDs. So that's how you just put things into a database. I would say if you decide to one day store your scraped or API'd data into a MongoDB database, this is something that you can pretty much just do in one line. If you have a list of dictionaries and you just want to store them in Mongo, you can do it just like that. And I would say if you realize that you stored something incorrect, or you maybe forgot to clean something that you had meant to, but just maybe you forgot, a very common process actually is to is to just delete everything and then reinsert the clean version. That usually is a lot easier than editing every single one, especially if the process that you're going to be doing is the same for like every entry. All right, so that is the C in CRUD. Next, we'll be talking about the read process, querying data. And querying data with SQL, we had the capability to query for like for a lot of different things. We could do like group bys. We could do, I think group bys is the one thing that's unique to SQL versus data like this. But we could do group bys. We could do different conditions and things like that. But Mongo is a little bit different because a lot of the data that is stored is a lot. Let's see, you don't really have that table form data. So usually the queries for Mongo are a lot more straightforward. And also if you want to do any filtering, sometimes it's easier to do the filtering after you have that data stored as like a Python data type. So several ways the one way to query is through a find function, which again also works on my collection, which if you remember, my collection is where all of our dictionaries are basically stored in my collection. So if I just want to find every quote that is by Albert Einstein, that's how you can do it. You can sort of see here that find is a cursor action. If you remember cursor, this looks kind of familiar because cursor is also what we use to connect to a SQL database. But just by doing this, you don't necessarily figure out like what these results are. So because it's some like object, we have to sort of work through this object. So this object is actually iterable. So you can sort of get a hint from the code below, but if we just edit this to do for x in my collection.find, and print X, you can see that these are our three results. So you can see here that there's an automatically generated ID, but you have the 3 quotes, 1, 2, and 3, all by Albert Einstein. And this is the 3 out of 10 quotes that were by Albert Einstein in our database. So yeah, that's the one finicky thing with MongoDB, is that when you're using the .find functions, you're storing the things here, you just have to, work with it this way. If, you can see that this isn't really saving anything. So maybe you want to make like a new list of results. And then let's just say that, okay, I just want to store each of these into my results. Maybe I can do results.append, and just as a quick cleaning, maybe I do, let's see, the quote being X quote, and then author, because since I don't need the ID, X author. See if this works. Okay, never mind. I'll look for the right code to do this, but storing this is pretty much the same as storing it into a result. Let's see if oh, that's right, because I forgot to run this one. Results.append, there we go. And then, yeah, that should have worked. Perfect. So now we have our list of dictionaries with only the information that we want stored back in there. And then whatever functions you need to run on that, you can do that here. Awesome. So just as another example, you can do the same for Steve Martin. Cool. So that is the R in CRUD. So moving on, we're going to look at the U in CRUD, which stands for update. And so you can actually update your data in Mongo. Again, with the example I mentioned earlier, if you had inserted a bunch of incorrect data and you want to change them, this is one way to do it. As you can see, the syntax is not the easiest to work with. So if it's something like a data cleaning process, I would suggest that you clean your data all over again first before just deleting your entire collection and reinserting. So this example is going to show how can I add a new key value pair to something in my MongoDB database. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to add some tags to a quote. So there is a Steve Martin quote here: "A day without sunshine is like, night." And I just want to add some tags to this quote. So the tags I want to add, I'm just going to store them in a list: change, deep thoughts, thinking world. These are just some like tags that maybe in my database, if I ever wanted to look up a quote by its tag, I can do that. So when you want to update your data, first you have to tell it which subset of data you want to update. So in this case, I only want to update every Steve Martin quote. And in this case, it just so happens that it's just one, but I'm telling it which subset of data I want to update, basically any piece of data whose author is Steve Martin. And then you want to show it, you want to tell it what kind of update you want to do. So usually when you're doing an update, when you do this $set, it can either add a new key value pair or overwrite an existing key value pair. So in this case, I'm using the $set to add quote tags as a new key. And I'm going to set the value to be this list of tags. And then here, I'm just going to update one, but you can actually do update many as well. But because I know there's just one here, I can do my collection.update one, give it what the subset is that I want to update, and then what I want to update it with. So a lot of steps, but it does basically what we want it to do. Here, I'm, again, just assigning it to a variable. Again, this is just to query to see what the updates are. You can see here that now in our Mongo database, when we previously only had this being the result, now this is our result with this new quote tags being this list of tags. Something that's pretty neat here is that As I think some of you have already seen with that movie project with some of the data there, within some columns of data, you might have like a nested list, which is actually quite difficult to work with. But that's not something that you have to worry about as much when you're dealing with document stores. Cool. So that's just updating data. Again, like the MongoDB data documentation is actually pretty good at like walking through like procedurally all the usual things that you have to do. Right. And the very last thing, and then we can talk about our project. The very last thing is just deleting data from Mongo. Again, it's an action that works on your collection. You can do delete one and you can also do delete many. And let's just say I want to delete one of Albert Einstein. So when I do this, delete one of Albert Einstein, one of the attributes that we can actually get is the how many we've deleted, and we've deleted one. And if I run this, you can see that previously we had 3 Albert Einstein quotes, but now we only have 2. If I actually run this again, we're only deleting 1. You'll see that now there's only 1 left. And then if I were to like rerun some code and I can do delete many, that'll just delete them all. But yeah, very unlikely will you be deleting data out of your database. I think it's important to know that as data scientists, whether you're working with like MongoDB or if you're working with something like SQL, the most common process you will be doing is the querying or the reading process. Maybe inserting data, but very unlikely will you have like, especially if it's like your first kind of data job, very rarely will you have, I guess, the clearance to do like the more destructive actions like deleting data or actually changing the way the data is being stored. But yeah, that was a really quick topic. Does anyone have any questions regarding this before I stop the recording? We can talk about some project things. Sweet. Awesome. Let's stop this recording here.